invitation. I can commiserate with being at Pearson. I actually met earlier in an earlier phase of my engagement with Toronto, and I'm just so delighted to be back here to learn more about the Institute for Life Course and Aging, although I turn to my slide because I keep having to remember what the title of the place is here, and all the interesting programs that exist connected to your program and in this building, including school districts and aging programs, so I feel kind of a little at home. Now, you heard a little bit about me, but can we go around and just say a word about perhaps your name, what you'd like to say about yourself? No showing business cards. We don't have the Zoom lens necessary for that. And without institutional review board experience, I want you to say the first word that came into your mind when I say the word intergenerativity. So with apologies to Sigmund Freud, in the absence of a couch, let's do a free association. So intergenerativity, what single word comes to your mind? So that's your name, something about yourself, and that response to that request. Please.
My name is Andrea Carice. I'm a PhD student in the Department of English here at U of T, but I'm also a research associate in geriatric medicine at the University of Western Ontario. The first word I free associated with intergenerativity was actually intergenerational, and originally I misread the title of the talk as that, so I think that counts as my Freudian.
Well, you can Google does the same thing. If you put in intergenerativity, it says, do you mean intergenerational? So consider yourself part of the global mind.
I have a walking database.
My name is Ainsley Morehouse. I'm currently doing my MSW here at U of T in social work. But I've also spent the last 10 years as an artist and theater practitioner. And last year I worked at Baycrest running a theater program with 9 residents of the Apotex Nursing Home. The first word that came to my mind was fun. So there.
It's becoming more and more Freudian as we go along. And then, sorry, I can't tell who's first. Please, we'll make sure we don't forget you by going to your next slide.
Okay, my name is Marie Shelton. I work at NICE, National Initiative for the Care of the Elderly, here. I also thought intergenerational is the kind of word that came to my mind first of all. But I was interested in a lot of thoughts. So I'm here to find out.
My name is Dr. and I'm a fellow researcher here in the institute. And what the first word coming to my mind was family or intergenerational relationships.
Margot French, retired from faculty of medicine. I thought initially flexibility, meaning more intellectual flexibility, and how you can alter, which is why I come to these things, my next life.
Very good.
Denise Murphy-Kilbride. I'm a professor emerita at Ryerson, doing research on people who come to Canada over the age of 50, and the first word that came to my mind, as it does so often, is my grandchildren.
I'm Sandra Downey, slightly different background than most people, in that I come from a corporate environment, and I was with Nortel for over 20 years. And when I left, I went back to school and became certified as a natural health practitioner. And right now I'm focused on the aging population over 55 and different projects within that, helping people transition into whatever that next chapter is all about. And the word that came to mind for me was family.
I'm Suzanne Cook, and I'm a gerontologist, adult educator, and academic entrepreneur. And I recently completed a postdoc at Baycrest, and I'm currently teaching at Seneca. I thought, I want to add more than one word. I'm thinking connection, community, families, generations, and possibilities. So that's what I'm thinking.
That's good, but we'll have to throw out your data because you didn't follow instructions. Just kidding.
You'll allow me that, right?
Don't want to start a trend here. We'll have an exposition.
I'm Rachel Schlesinger.
We'll go around one more time with the exercise and when we get settled.
Rachel Schlesinger. I'm 3/4 retired from York University, where I teach social gerontology and do research and in intergenerational work in families.
and I also am a senior volunteer at Baycrest, working at the Bravo project as well. And inter, for me, I stop at inter and between. So I think things that are between. My name is Georgia Jacoby. I come at this from a slightly different angle as well. My training is in molecular biology and process engineering, but I've been active. I was in corporate world for 20 years, and I've been active as a caregiver for the last 3. And when I saw the title, I guess it's engineering, I look at generative and inter, and it's basically a cross-referencing of different fields and ideas.
Boy, you guys are good. The reference standard being you're very good at me, of course. Good ideas.
Hi, my name is Laura Park, and I'm a master's student with the Institute of Medical Science at U of T. First word I thought of was just cross-generation.
Cross-generation.
Yeah.
Gail Houston, I'm a retired gerontological nurse, and now I'm hard to figure out what my first word was. Now I'm hearing so many other words, but really connections.
My name is Michael Hutchin. I'm a physician at the Toronto General. And I guess when I...
We're back. You look familiar. Sorry, Michael.
No. And when I look at it as sort of generational reciprocity.
Hi, my name is Paul Sok, and I am a PhD student at the Institute of Medical Science and also a fellow of the Institute of Aging. And the first term that I'm thinking about the title is interaction, life course interaction.
International.
I'm Barry Drenham. I'm with the Department of Occupational Science and Occupational Therapy. First word that came to mind when my mind was contribution.
Contribution. Oh, interesting. So for those of you that came in late, we'll go around the circle one more time. There are more seats that can be pulled out, Susan? Or,
yes.
At least for a moment I can say I'm standing room only.
Two over here.
Right. So the exercise is who are you, how you identify yourself in this, this group, and when I say the word intergenerativity, what is your Freudian association with that? Well, it doesn't have to be Freudian. What's your so let's start again here. And can you lead us off with your name and where you're from? And if I say the word intergenerativity, there's no right answer, just what word comes to your mind?
I'm really good, but anyways, my name is Zed. I'm just a new student in university. I'm learning social work master's in it.
So an inquiring mind around intergenerativity. You came to learn what it is. Great. Anybody else want to go next?
I'm Lillian Wells. I'm retired from the Faculty of Social Work at the University of Toronto, and I'm president of the Toronto Council on Aging. And I think of growth and development.
Who else has not had a chance to say who they are? Please, I'm sorry.
I'm Penelope Tyndale. My main qualification is that I'm aging. And I think I'm a retired psychotherapist and adult educator with a degree from U of T, and I'm active in the Academy for Lifelong Learning, which is an extension department of U of T. I came to a couple of lectures last year and really enjoyed them, and thought this is very stimulating. Lovely to have you people really interested in quality of life for my generation.
Well, excellent. Did everybody have a chance to introduce themselves, please?
My name is Marcus Schaefer. I'm in the Department of Sociology here at U of T. And intergenerativity, I guess I think of sharing knowledge across generational lines.
Well, very, very good. So as Susan mentioned, I'm working at Baycrest. I am a geriatric neurologist, but the main focus of my work will be, or my fun this afternoon is to share with you some stories from this intergenerational school that we started in Cleveland. And part of my work here in Canada is to share ideas and draw connections. And when you said the word inter, for me, intergenerative is kind of inter. It's interprofessional, it's interdisciplinary, it's international. It is about making connections. It's actually a neologism. That's to say, Google doesn't identify it as a word in the English language. So it's interesting we can have associations with words that don't exist, although thanks to a famous Canadian, it now is a meme that's spreading. I'm going to be talking about two things. One is a different way of thinking about health, and I think you'll get confused. I'm talking about health and education in this talk. The blending between health and education for me as a health educator, if you will, is really an intimate conversation, and it's part of the conversation we want to have through Michael Fullen with people here in Toronto, and I'll explain that as we go along by telling you stories. It's also a critique of medicine. Doctors are barely willing to consider biopsychosocial as a broader conception of health, and they own the biology, but they've got the biology wrong, in my opinion. So medicine is far too driven by approaches that are molecular and genetic and reductionistic. And if we are to create a healthy community, we've got to, in my view, create an evolutionary medical framework, an environmental framework that is a blend of focusing on the biology in a broader way, and of course culture. My definition is it's a blend of innovation and integration, but it is what you said. Generativity is a lovely positive word that we have in our languages, I would guess in many languages, that says here's a source of creativity in society. But my focus is on blending or bringing together different domains, like the domain of health and the domain of education. So somebody mentioned resilience. Many people mentioned family and those kinds of things. And somebody actually said, there's a lovely Sufi proverb, kind of I'm paraphrasing here, going between, that's the inter, in order to go beyond. In fact, I actually think that perhaps the Eastern ways of thinking about life are a bit more open to this kind of inter. It's a focus on process, not structure, and a focus on the connectivity between ideas, not necessarily ideas. So that's, and Michael Fullen was at OISE, and is well known in Toronto and the world for his systems change work in the Ontario public school systems. And I was very pleased when I saw him again talking about our work together, that he gave me a copy of his book, Stratosphere, so I'm plugging his book here for a minute, which is all about the major transformation that's going to occur in education and in health around the interface between pedagogy and information technology. And he actually referred to the word intergenerativity in the book. So now the meme is at least spreading through Canada through such a distinguished international citizen. Now, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about myself, because I guess somebody said they're aging. Somebody relates to these things personally. And I am going to start with me, and I apologize for that, but it'll put basically, this is my TED talk or my TEDx talk, and I use a procedure called Prezi, not PowerPoint, and I'm not going to run you through the whole 18 minutes because, as you know, you may know, TED Talks are limited by that. Don't worry, this cows every time. We haven't figured out how to get rid of it. I am a neurologist that started my journey in different places, but one of which is to take on the social concept of Alzheimer's. So I've offered you two new words to consider. Now I'm going to ask you to consider that old word in a different way and the stories around that word, using it provocatively, the fact that Alzheimer's, as we currently define it today, is a myth. And we'll get from, okay, if the medical model of Alzheimer's is incomplete, or perhaps even worse than that, misguided and wrong, how do we then develop a more positive story around this word? And that involves people with dementia coming to school with children, just to foreshadow in the intergenerational school. So I like to, and I'll come back to this theme, think that I was a scientist before I could talk. I'm going to go through these quickly. I'm not doing the whole presentation. And this whole notion that we are built with a certain sense of wonder, about the world and a curiosity about it, which of course is channeled in different ways. It can be channeled into science, and in my case it was channeled into science. But there's more than just the curiosity and the kind of fundamental relationship to people and natural systems that we want to learn more about. And for me, it's always been about words and their connections, and particularly their connections in stories. So if you say, what did you hear for an hour of questions afterwards, you could talk about this crazy physician who was telling stories that he thought was coherent, but I couldn't understand a word he said, hopefully not. But stories start with, not necessarily with words, because you can have stories without words, but I was, my PhD is in psycholinguistics, so I was interested in words and their boundaries, how they connect to each other. And sometimes the evolution of words in a cultural sense. After I got my PhD, went into the laboratory, the neuropathology laboratory, and did studies of what I was then considering Alzheimer's disease. And the irony of somebody who was interested in the brain and words is I studied, and you don't need to know too much, oh golly, Dave, help me here. Greek or Latin? Come on, somebody tell me, which is it? Substantia nominata. Sorry? Latin. Thank you. I stopped my Latin training when I was about 4 years old in England. Anyway, the substantia nominata pretty clearly stands for the unnamed substance. What a fascinating adventure in the brain. There was actually something that was left unnamed. The substantia nominata exists. The substantia nigra, the black substance, the substantia rubra, the red substance. So they ran out of colors or something. It's a structure that's in the brain and is affected, as you can see. This is a healthy complement of nerve cells. This is the effects of a process that we call Alzheimer's. And it's now called the cholinergic basal forebrain because it's located deep in the brain, but it uses a chemical messenger, a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine. And we went on to study how cholinergic systems worked in the brain, and from that helped develop collaboratively ideas about treatment. And you can see that word choline right in the middle of this. This is the major form of treatment for Alzheimer's, cholinesterase inhibitors, which essentially are a minor and not very significant contribution to this one chemical imbalance that we find in Alzheimer's and other conditions. So it led to people taking pills for these memory problems that we know characterize Alzheimer's. But I did a lot of work with the pharmaceutical industry and talk about storytellers. They are powerful, particularly south of the border where we have the unfortunate direct-to-consumer marketing, which dominates, if you ever listen to the Buffalo or other stations, our primetime television. So there was more to the story, and I became very concerned about pharmacoeconomics. I did a lot of conferences, just how should we determine whether paying for these medicines for Alzheimer's disease is worth it or not. And there are lots of books in this category. This is a friend of mine, Carl Elliott, who's the only investigative bioethicist I know who go after freedom of information to track down adventures on the dark side of medicine, white coat, black hat. So I really became concerned that the pharmaceutical industry was distorting our conversations about health, our conversations about biology. It's all about creating a long list of medicines for older people. And I sometimes say that I've probably done more good for people's memories as they're getting older by taking people off medications and putting them on medications. There's more to the story, my story. We'll get to your story in a minute. I was a brain banker. I used to collect brains. Sounds like a strange occupation, but it's a necessary undertaking if you're trying to understand the biological basis, and I started the brain bank at Hopkins. But the more and more I talked to individual patients, and in this case he was a professor of biochemistry, that led to interesting aspects of his memory loss. This was his wife. She was my patient too. My world record couple is a 97-year-old that have been married for 73 years.
Wow.
And I'm actually honored to be caring for both of them. But anyway, it's just a little bit about me as we go, before we go into the elaboration of this. So what that told me was that Alzheimer's is a very variable process. So every disease is variable. Every disease is heterogeneous. But there's so much variability in what we call Alzheimer's disease at the clinical level, at the biological level, at the genetic level. There are over 300 mutations that cause Alzheimer's of various forms that I've begun to really question whether it was useful, whether the story that Alzheimer's is a single disease waiting to be cured by the right, undoubtedly Nobel Prize winning wealthy person who, is the salvation of all older people who have a little memory problem. You'll notice a certain skepticism. And so this is actually a doodle, a wordle of the book that we ended up writing, which is called The Myth of Alzheimer's, What You Aren't Being Told About Today's Most Dreaded Diagnosis. The essential part of the myth is that Alzheimer's shouldn't be a singular noun. It's multiple conditions. And the other part of it is that it is intimately related to aging. There is everybody, to one degree or another, gets some brain shrinkage, gets some neuronal loss, gets some plex and tangle, so we cannot, despite spending tens of billions of dollars for the definitive test to say you've got Alzheimer's or not, produce that test, and I don't think we ever will, because I don't think there is one clear marker between aging and Alzheimer's. So that's the myth. And by the way, it's not very controversial. The title of the book was a little controversial, but that's what I just said about the relationship with aging and its heterogeneity is now well known, and I'll get to that. There's more to the story. You think I'm interested in stories, wouldn't you? And that is, of course, the story of the intergenerational school, which is largely what I'm going to be talking to. By the way, I'll pause at the end of this Prezi, and anybody who doesn't want to hear the elaboration can just move on. But this is a school where we connect, guide, and create these learning communities, and some but not all of the patients shown here have dementia, have a memory problem. We focus on particularly not only connecting people across the ages, but also with nature. So this is our Shaker Nature Center. And this is them winning the Rachel Carson Sense of Wonder Prize that is offered by the Environmental Protection Agency. So now we see, I'm looking at Andrea because she knows so much more about stories than I do, so we're looping back to the beginning. The sense of wonder that I had is the sense of wonder we're trying to create in our school. Or not create, discover, unearth. There's more to your story. This is where this becomes irrelevant directly because this is where I gave the talk. It happened to be a TEDx talk in Asheville, North Carolina, in an old observatory. And so I kind of took the wonder out into the universe and talked about stories without borders. I'll make a reference to Margaret Atwood later if I remember, because I read science fiction and fantasy, and this whole notion that you can go to all kinds of universes through story. And you can also go to universes inside virtual reality. So this is one of my other alter egos. This is Echo Wise dressed in my Ferguson kilt. I wish I had the accent, I wish I had the kilt in real life for that matter. And some of my collaborators, which I'll tell you about, who are creating intergenerational adventures in Second Life with an avatar. And we're going to be doing some of this work in Toronto, so I'm particularly interested, as I mentioned when I was talking about Michael Fullen's book, Stratosphere, about the use of information technology to create universes, to create stories, to create the kind of connectivity that I've shared. Here we are with friend of mine, and we're also doing it through a university project, which I'll elaborate on a little bit, which is Gigabit connectivity. In other words, how can we use very broadband connections to link people together around the world? And this is the Prezi format. All of those images I just showed you are out of this smoke coming from the book. So there clearly is more to our story, and for this morning, it's going to be that I'm now going to switch to PowerPoint and elaborate on some of these points. So if you're totally confused about what happened to me as an individual or the school, how my wife and I came to form that school, just hang on. But let's go back to the medicine for a minute. This was the second book actually the third book we did the year after the book called The Myth of Alzheimer's. It was with colleagues at Hopkins, where I trained, and it was a little bit less provocative. It was treating dementia. That sounds like a pretty typical thing, but the side bar here was, do we have a pill for that? So we're kind of switching into the space that says dementia, which is a very negative word, because it can be used pejoratively in a number of languages, including not only French, German, English, but Chinese and Japanese. When you say somebody has chiho, it really says they've got disease, but they're also idiots. So it has that same connotation. So the psychiatrists are trying to get rid of the word dementia in DSM-5, the official nomenclature, but you can get rid of stigma just by changing the name. Now, the world of Alzheimer's, since we wrote the book, has really been, if we want to treat Alzheimer's, we ask the question, well, what are we treating? Well, there have been so many failed drug studies. If you have a failed drug study, do people think, well, maybe the drug doesn't work? Occasionally, but rarely. Usually they think they didn't give it early enough, and they didn't give it the right dose. So how do we give a pill to somebody who has Alzheimer's early? Well, we give it to people with asymptomatic Alzheimer's. How many of you found that a strange combination of words? Well, but that is real. I was on this panel. I didn't have to invent this story. They're doing it for themselves, you know. So, in other words, if you don't have any symptoms, the only way you define whether you've got something called Alzheimer's is you have to do a test with something called a biomarker. You have to do a spinal fluid test or a brain imaging test. Unfortunately, there are as many people promoting a biomarker as there are people promoting biomarkers that they don't agree exactly. I'm exaggerating slightly, but whether you use spinal fluid or a genetic test or an imaging test is very controversial. So they're creating out of this Alzheimer's concept a very different concept, which is it's defined by its biology, not by its clinical features. On the other hand, when they published 4 sets of new guidelines, this was the first. The last one to appear was the neuropathology criteria. Now, I've just said we're going to define it by a biomarker. So how many of you have heard the expression, to diagnose Alzheimer's disease definitely, you need to look at autopsy tissue? You heard that? Well, guess what? They replaced the word definite with disengaged, because there are a lot of people running around, and the study that got a lot of attention south of the border was the nuns study. They studied nuns, and then about 30% of the nuns had enough plaques and tangles that a pathologist looking at the brain would have said they have Alzheimer's, but they didn't have significant memory problems. So the gold standard that's definite is flawed by the fact that there is no neuropathologist who would ever make a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, if they had any sense, without asking, was the patient significantly impaired in terms of their cognitive function? So they took the word disengaged out of the final document, but I had a draft copy. So we've gone from, well, we're going to have to define it early before symptoms because that's, and we have to do that with biology, to, wait a minute, at the end when we've got all the biology we want right in front of us under the microscope, we can't be sure whether it's Alzheimer's without knowing something about the clinical features. So I think there's something a little bit disturbed in this story and this label, Alzheimer's. The research summit that was called by, I guess you could say, I don't want to blame Barack Obama for it, the head of NIH, I'd love to blame him, in May of 2012. And I'm telling you lots of recent stories. I'll continue to do this. The one thing you shouldn't say about this talk, you can say anything else you want about it, is it wasn't up to date. Now, May is a little bit old now, but here's what they did when they got all the best scientists together, saying, well, what should we do to tackle these problems? Well, one word that came out a lot was, this is not a linear process. This is not one molecule that goes awry that causes dementia. This is a systems disease. Does this sound like heterogeneity or what? And here, the head of the NIH is an evangelical Christian, which is okay, but he's also an evangelical genomicist who writes books like The Language of God, in which he says essentially God is speaking to us through our genes. And we've just gone a little crazy, and in fact this slide said genomics and high throughput screening, science, madness. In other words, there is this sense that if we just mapped everybody's genes and we just created all the chemicals you could possibly imagine, you know, eventually we'd figure out that one chemical fixed this problem, one drug. And that one I won't go into, but there's a real problem with replicability. Every study, and we were responsible for one in Cleveland, every study that's a breakthrough for Alzheimer's, I'm going to make a rough guess, more than half are never replicated. In other words, a fundamental caveat in science is you don't believe it until there are two studies or that's been confirmed by other people. That's supposed to be the spirit of science, the communication between people. Unfortunately, the proprietary nature of science now begins to limit people's ability to communicate because they don't want to share the intellectual property associated with discovery. So science has been distorted, and the science that's promoted in the papers is often one university wanting to grab part of the limelight or one drug company wanting to promote a particular approach. And that's not, it's a powerful part of the story. Who would not like to find a cure for Alzheimer's? But, you know, we can't, would you want to find a cure for brain aging? Well, if Alzheimer's is really just forms of brain aging, where is the legitimate science and where is the hype? Where is the hype and the false hope? What are we looking at here? That's basically the message I'm trying to leave you with. The last straw was, for me, and I was quoted as such on the news, was this guy in New York who thinks that amyloid is so important, and I would agree with him that most people have paid attention to amyloid. And amyloid, I can elaborate, is a protein that's found inside the plaques that I mentioned are part of the biology, but it's only a part. And so he said, well, we've got to manage your amyloid level your entire life. So I suppose that means doing a spinal tap on a child in utero to know what their amyloid level is. And the drug companies would love to get us addicted to an amyloid drug the way they have to statins. I don't know what it's like in Canada because I don't practice in Canada, but, and I was just talking to Sid Feldman, the wonderful family medicine doctor at Baycrest. He and I are both actually concerned that this promotion of statins in older people is quite possibly more harmful than we imagine because it affects muscles. It can cause muscle inflammation, but it also can cause weakness. So how many times do we hear people who are older who are complaining of weakness and fatigue and perhaps some muscle pain, where it may be, in fact, a reaction to this drug that is just ubiquitous. I mean, we might as well just have pill dispensing stations at every geriatric clinic. So this notion that pharma wants a drug like this, this is why they're seduced by the size of the market. I mean, who would not want to take a pill that would prevent Alzheimer's? So that's the medical story. That's the myth. That's what I'm suggesting we need to have a more critical mind about. And the question is, if it's not going to be fixed in the way that I've talked about, what kind of things do we have to do as society that actually might have the benefit of thinking about brain health, not in older people, but brain health through as a lifespan? And rather than just talking about plaques and tangles, how do we have the individual person, in this case Alzheimer's first case, the first lady that he described in 1906, and we have to go from genes into stories, into a kind of collective conversation space about imagining how we can do things differently. We have been starting this process in the school, and I can't tell you the story behind each of these images. I will tell you that this important part of this story. That's my wife. She's the principal of the school, and we started the school together a number of years ago. And this is David Satcher. He's a graduate of our medical school, but also the first African-American Surgeon General of the United States. And our school, as I will show you, addresses largely disadvantaged urban youth, although our elders in the school are more diverse than that. And so with this influence, we are promoting this eco-psychosocial model of health. It's like the World Health Organization. It's not just the absence of disease. It focuses on brain health, not because the brain deserves its special place in health. Fortunately, most of what we can do to take care of our brain health is good for our body. It is not only individual health, but it's public health. So we're talking about culture, we're talking about the built environment, we're talking about putting a system together, and the illustration I will share with you is our clinic that is not running yet called InterWell, in which we blend education and health, promoting, and we're not embarrassed by this notion, we can create a kind of collective wisdom and a quality of life for the individuals as well as the community that they're a part of. So I've been writing about taking brain health to a deeper and broader level. Well, there are clearly lots of things that would be nice to have: diet, physical activity, keeping your mind active. But the depth is, why on earth do you want to stay alive? What is the sense of purpose that you have as an individual human being? I think, and the breadth is that many sages will tell us that if your sense of purpose has in it a relationship to other people, community, that is likely to be a deeper connectivity that extends even beyond your biological mortality in terms of a sense of legacy. So here you have a neurologist telling you, yes, well, it's not going to be pills, not even going to be diet. Yes, exercise is important. We'll talk about that. But basically, we've got to think about, well, why are we alive and what do we want to leave as our legacy? So 13 years ago, we started the Intergenerational School. My wife is a developmental psychologist, and I'm a gerontologically oriented, psycholinguistically inclined MD, PhD, so we had a little credibility, I suppose. Our daughters had all gone on to careers in nursing, medicine, and education, so we felt good about that, and then we figured we needed a larger family. So we started this school in 2000, and we now have 227 elementary school children, most of whom are African American, although that's changing a bit as the school changes. It's a public school. It's a charter school, for those of you that track that effort in the States. The teachers' unions don't like us, although frankly in Cleveland they've come to like us a bit more, because we don't hire unionized teachers. And we've been rated with the top performing charter school in the state of Ohio, and we've been recognized for some of these efforts. And all these pictures I'm showing, many I've snapped myself, and they include some of my patients, including Mrs. Atwood. So if I show a picture or use a name, it's always permission. The mission is this multi-generational school to get people together, connected to be lifelong learners and spirited citizenship. And the vision, that was the mission for the school. The vision we're into with here in Toronto and elsewhere, is to be in conversation with other communities about bringing these kinds of ideas. I think you can do intergenerational learning in many, many different places, many, many different ways. So we're promoting ideas. We haven't trademarked the Intergenerational School. We have another intergenerational school on the near west side of Cleveland, and we're talking to the Ministry of Education in Ontario. We've got programs in Spain and one in Japan I'll mention. From the educational model, it's social construction. Knowledge is socially constructed, which is the theme of my entire talk, right? I mean, get a scientist to understand that Alzheimer's disease is first and foremost two words and not terrible chronic progressive neurodegenerative disease. And by the way, Alzheimer never thought he described a separate disease. So the problem with this terminology started with a man whose name is associated with him. And the learning is a lifelong developmental process. Here we are at the Institute for Life Course in Aging. It's a developmental curriculum, so the children are not in grades. We have 3 clusters primary, junior, and senior. And those are divided by stages. And kids stay in a classroom with the same teacher for often 3 years. So there's not this notion that you have to go from one class to the next and you're failed if you don't advance with the rest of your classmates. So it recognizes that chronology is not the best way to define where a particular learner is. By the way, that can extend beyond the elementary school model into adults as well. The school values, we focus on things like honoring our elders. Our seniors, who are about 15, came to Baycrest, and after they were gone, the elders in Baycrest, by the way, I'm living in the terraces of the Baycrest, so they came and visited my home. The elders were still talking about these young African-American kids from Cleveland who just seemed so able to engage with conversation with them. Because that's what they've learned. They've learned to honor the elders. They interpersonal skills. Where's the web of life? Okay. I thought there was one that actually said web of life, but maybe that's embedded in that. It's celebration of diversity, but honoring the web of life as well is part of it. And actually our report cards evaluate the kids on their development, both with regards to their cognitive skills, but also with regards to their values. And we give awards to kids for values as much as cognitive performance. So we're kind of into this vision thing. We started with the public school. We're moving towards more generalization, dissemination. We have a grant to do that. We're now kind of influencing other programs. And really what we want to do is to bring back, in some sense, I mean, it's silly, family. Many of you mentioned family. Intergenerational programming exists in the world. It has. It's probably the reason that we did as well as a species. But because of urbanization and women working and other things, the standard extended family, even in countries like the Mediterranean countries and the Asian countries where there's a stronger emphasis, it's increasingly hard to maintain these kind of intergenerational conversations. We are fortunate for a small school to have programs that are I want to say extracurricular, but that's not really the case. In fact, many of the extracurricular programs are probably as important as the curricular ones to our goals. So we've got a full-time art teacher, a music teacher, phys ed teacher, a science teacher. We've got gardens, we've got dance clubs, we got gardening twice. I have to mention that to Eric. Gardening's important, as you'll hear in a minute. And you can't see this, but this we did for our grant review, our site visit. I'll show you about. We're very connected, and we've been honored by a number of people, as I mentioned before. So that's us. We're trying to create lifelong learners and spirited citizens. Now let's come back to some of the themes that I mentioned around environment and elders. So since the beginning of now we're an urban school, but we're fortunate that our watershed is pretty close by and actually relatively protected by geography. So we can walk, and by the way, I should point out, this is not just the very young and the very old. We have college undergraduates, we have nursing students, medical students, so we don't think of intergenerational learning as just bipolar, as I sometimes say. These are management students, so we got a bunch of MBAs to come and dig in the dirt and create the edible forest garden, which is it'll be going for a few years now. The whole point of this permaculture model is to teach kids about many things, systems thinking, but also the value of local food. The average piece of food in the United States is said to travel 2,000 miles before you eat it, and that's not sustainable. So local food is good for a conversation about your individual health and about public health. We are concerned, as I said before, about an eco-psychosocial model of health. It's kind of interesting, the thing that came out recently from Consumer Reports was all the concern about arsenic in foods. Well, we still have, we have lots of problems in industrial cities, and we participated in a report from the Collaborative on Health and Environment on environmental threats to healthy aging with a closer look at Alzheimer's and particularly Parkinson's disease, where I think the evidence is even stronger. There are some specific environmental threats. And so in June, we had a conference, Healthy Environments Across the Generations, where we got child advocates, elder advocates, and environmental advocates to be in conversation about how we could work together. Lead poisoning is still a huge problem in industrial cities, in some, I think, I sometimes say I'm in a more civilized country, so I don't know what your problems are in Canada, to be frank with you, but certainly in some of the industrial cities like Cleveland, the United States, we still have a problem. And we still have a problem with paint in certain circumstances, with Ayurvedic medicine being, having a lot of lead in it. We're going to have problems with mercury, depending on how we deal with coal as a source of energy. So this is an interprofessional, intergenerational, interprofessional, therefore intergenerative. Medical students, parents, law students, nursing students, getting together to share their knowledge and early professional experiences about environmental health. We've published one study, and this is it, showing that volunteering in the school had an impact on people who came in from Judson Park, which is one of our long-term care partners. I should point out that every one of our classes is linked to a long-term care facility. And so it was a randomized control study. We took about 18 elders. Some stayed and did a peer group intervention at the long-term care facility. Others came to the school and worked with kids. They all had mild to moderate dementia. The intervention was storytelling, story sharing, using objects, using books, using stories from their own lives. And lo and behold, we had one p-value, less than 0.05, in stress levels that were lower in the school group. I guess it's more stressful if you have to sit and talk to your peers than to kids. I don't want to over-exaggerate this. I mean, if one measure had gone a different direction, it would have been a different story, meaning, if one person didn't show up on a certain day or whatever. As somebody who has done a lot of evidence-based medicine, I'm the first to criticize this study, but it's remarkable how much discourse space you get by being able to say, we did a positive randomized control study, so it must be true. But the truer part of it is the stories that people share. And Danny George, who's the co-author of my book, is an anthropologist who got his degree at Oxford with this research I'm showing you, Oxford in the UK. So he found in the stories that there was relationships, there were proxy grandchildren, racial reconciliation because of the white-black differences between the adults and the elders, a sense of purpose and usefulness, and some direct health benefits, perhaps. I'll show photographs where we published this in several places. I'll show photographs and stories because it illustrates this. This is one of my favorite. This is Dr. Charlotte Miller, who was the first PhD medical historian in the United States. And she didn't have any of her own kids. And when she came over, she just woke up to her adopted grandchildren and eventually ended up giving us her library. When we published these stories, Old Lives Tale is something in the American Geriatrics Society Journal. One particular story I like is the legacy of the Clark Freeway fighters. So in 1962, a corrupt politician wanted to put a highway through where I live, actually, the community around the school, Shaker Heights. And the women, Republicans, when Republicans were different. I ducked an opportunity. Went after the politician and, to their surprise, became the tennis shoe community activists. Kay Fuller, who you'll see other images of, was one of the leaders. She now has dementia, not to the point where she can't tell the story. And so here are our kids, hearing the story of how 50 years ago these folks saved the Nature Center, trying to pass the baton of responsibility for watersheds. We do a lot of work on water and watersheds. And we wrote that one up too. That was just published. This is the most timely thing. I got this reprint 2 days ago. Now, I'm coming near the end, but I'm just showing you some more stories and more images. I'll probably be giving you about another 10 minutes, and then so this is your time to think about questions. So let's see. 10 days ago, we were site visited by the Eisner Foundation. That is a foundation created by Michael Eisner, who is perhaps best known for his work with Disney. They give a prize to the best intergenerational program in the country. They give small checks. I guess the other one is larger, $5,000. If we're a finalist for the $100,000 final finalist, grand finalist. So they came and they visited the school. So it was a good opportunity for me to capture a few more photographs. Thing was amazing was every classroom, we have so many visitors, every classroom has an ambassador, or more than one, and they come up and they greet visitors, and you know they practice their social skills and just overwhelm people. We're never going to win this award because we're up against Generations United and Experience Corps, which are big Washington-based programs. We're never going to win the award unless we communicated intergenerativity. And the handshakes with the kids, the conversations with the older people. We have, I think, a deep and broad experience with it, and so hopefully they fell in love with us. This is one of my patients again. This guy's been with us for almost 13 years. It's interesting, he's aging in place in the school, and you can see him actually becoming a bit cognitively frail, and how the school embraces him even as that aging process takes effect. And this is another opportunity for sharing. This is the intergenerational coordinator at Judson, the community working. This is Kay again. This is Kathy Barber. Again, this was slightly staged because Lynn would probably not normally carry the book around, so we staged after the site visitors. But all these relationships and things are quite natural. So we're trying to develop a health practice. There is something called the National Assembly of School-Based Healthcare in Washington. We're calling it, instead of the Intergenerational Health and Wellness Practice, InterWell. And it basically puts all these ideas that we've just been talking about into a blend of education and health again, hopefully an intergenerative blend. In fact, in this we were obviously focusing on the word inter, because it's interprofessional, it's a blend of family medicine, but also public health. It entertains alternative models of health, which include coaching, which I do. I have some people I'm a health coach for, not a neurologist. It includes self-management, and it's in early days. We will focus on local foods. We will focus on the arts, music, and dancing. This is the first year our garden was started. These are not fertility rights, but who knows? Dancing and music in the garden is a good thing. We use technology, and this is kind of where I'm ending up with. So this is actually a parent, and this is a game on the Microsoft Kinect. How many of you have heard of the Wii Fit or the Microsoft Kinect? You look like you're the right age to either be using them or know them in your families. So this is amazing technology. You can get a whole group of people dancing in front of these avatars. Everybody thinks that their wiggling relates to this person's wiggling, but it's not. It's only the one person is, two people actually in front of the monitor. But the idea is that two people can exercise. This is one of our collaborators, Dr. Kawashima, who is actually a Japanese doctor in real life, who developed some of these brain games. So we're doing studies to try to see whether this form of exercise done intergenerationally, as you might imagine, could help both groups. And it's relating to healthcare change in the United States particularly. And I think you have fewer problems in this country, but you have some of the same. This was a report that just appeared about a week ago. And it makes the point that older folks are on lots of medications, they see lots of doctors, 27 different healthcare providers on average. And the worst thing is that, particularly if you have congestive heart failure, 1 out of every 5 older person, actually with congestive heart failure, it's 1 out of every 4, are readmitted within 30 days to a hospital they're discharged and they go into the community and they don't know what to do with their medicines, they don't know what to do with their diet, and they're bounced back in. So we've got $750 billion worth of inefficiencies and sometimes criminal behavior in our healthcare system, and we think that this InterWell clinic can help empower people to be responsible for some of their own health care and to navigate the non-system. This also appeared in July. The cost and effectiveness of environmental approaches to disease prevention. The blue bars are environmental, the orange bars are non-clinical, and the green are clinical interventions, and these are measures of how good they were in improving quality of life for a certain price. And being down this end are good. So you can see environment does real well, non-clinical does okay, and clinical does worse, and in fact that category increases cost and causes I can't read it, but anyway, it's bad to be at that part of the graph. In fact, it's interesting. How many of you have heard of Dan Buettner, who studied blue zones? Dan Buettner went around the world from National Geographic, and he found places where people live a long time. They not only live a long time, but they enjoy living a long time. And there were lots and lots of variables, some of which fit into this taking community, brain health to a deeper and broader level. Probably a sense of community is the most important, and purpose. But you know what? In his study, there was no relationship with whether there was a healthcare system nearby. And in one study I saw, it was actually negatively related. You have too much healthcare around, it might actually be harmful. So I think the whole, so we're trying to be part of this change in the environmental approach. I'm not going to talk to you about that. We're doing a lot of work with tech. Well, I'll say this: this is a kind of an organization that looks at computer information technology approaches, optimizing health through neuroplasticity, innovation, and data. Title: Does brain fitness require medicalization? So there's a push from the IT side to ask, you know, are there things we can do like the Microsoft Kinect that promote healthier behaviors? And by the way, I think most of the healthier behaviors could be promoted by environmental changes, not focusing on individuals. Very interesting. I'm looking forward to meeting Mayor Ford one of these days. And his attitude towards bicycle paths, for example. I'm a bicyclist, and that was part of the appeal of coming to Toronto, frankly, but we're nowhere, even this city, near where the Netherlands and other places are. But that's what I mean about, you know, if you want to promote physical fitness, just embed it in the community and make it a part of what people do. And of course, you do much better on public transportation here, so good for you. I took the subway, I didn't ride my bicycle here from Whitehouse. The whole notion of this gigabit connectivity that I showed you at the very last slide of my presentation with all the flying pictures. In Cleveland, we're working with gigabit connectivity. That's about 100 times more connectivity that you have in the average home. So with that, you can do all kinds of interesting things across the internet. We had a conference here, again, about a week ago on the Gigabit Breakfast Club, where this whole notion that we're kind of part of this giant noosphere, this giant brain, and the question is, how can we use that to promote education and promote health? These are two of my patients who live on a community called Hessler Road, which is right in the middle of our university, best known for its street fair. And they're the king and queen, unofficially, the mayor and mayoress of that particular community. And so Hessler Road is connected into this digital network. So this was not the intimacy of our usual health coaching session. This was me turning my back to an audience of about 348 people, having a conversation with Pitta. It's Pitt or Pat. That's not her real name, but I could use a real name, but I want Pitta and Pat. Pitta has enough of a memory problem that they are trying to decide whether they leave this community that they've been embedded in for all these years and become honored as the honorary leaders. And they also are the landlords, so that probably is why they get some attention. for many of the buildings, they're thinking about moving to that nursing home that I showed you a picture of. And so how you help somebody who is so connected to that community. And what her husband said, because he's trying to make nice with the Chief Information Technology of my university, is trying to promote this idea. They are very pleased that Judson has that interconnectivity that they have in Hessler Road, because maybe they can use that interconnectivity, that gigabit connectivity, to maintain their connections. Actually, at that conference, I got him to commit to doing the Microsoft Kinect exercise across the broadband, because that would be a wonderful thing of having people exercising with their grandchildren, even if they're not in the same place. Here's Baycrest. Here are some of our virtual reality collaborators. These are, this is Bianca Stern, her Baral Marino. This is Jenna and Marty. Their avatars were shown in my production, and we're now developing a transmedia approach to connecting people. We're talking about a virtual Baycrest. And transmedia basically means that a story shows up in more than one place at one time. So there's a television program connected to a video game. There's a movie connected to a toy. There's a podcast related to a book. And so the world of storytelling is changing from the days of the printing press and the book to a distributed, immersive platform in which we have the potential, I believe, to use this technology to create the kinds of stories that I think are essential to aging well, but more than that, aging well as a community, aging well as a person, aging well as a community, and frankly, aging well as a species. It is going to be a terrible tragedy if, when the big story is told about our species, that the experiment with being conscious, with being sentient, turns out to be an evolutionary dead end. So we are thinking big. We have a program in Japan. And I want to end with this story, which just occurred at my university a couple of days ago. This was a week or so ago. All of you would know David Suzuki, I presume, the legacy, the sacred balance. He's a world-famous Canadian. You have lots of them. And, oops, I could get into dangerous territory there. And David was given the prize by Mr. Inamori, who is the head of Kyocera in Japan, and a Buddhist monk. So he's a most remarkable character. And David was given the prize for his work bringing attention to these issues I just alluded to. How can we learn better to stay healthy? And how can that be thought out in terms of long-term for the future of our species as well as our grandchildren? And these happen to be two advisors to the school who are sitting there with David Suzuki, so we were very pleased that that these ideas are promoted. And I'm going to end with these slides, and this is a ploy to engage Andrea's attention. There are many ways that you can. She's an English, not professor yet. She's a PhD in English. They scared me. I tell you, I'm still recovering from my experiences with English professors. But as you can tell, as I've gotten older, I've gotten more into this conversation about stories and metaphor. So one of my bucket lists, have you heard that expression? The things you want to do was to climb in the Himalayas. So here I am at about 17,000 feet. And I think if you want to be intergenerative with language, one of the best ways to do that is with metaphors. So I quote Aldo Leopold and Arnie Ness and some environmental male figures as saying that we as a species need to think like a mountain. We need to think long-term, broad-based, and with a sense of sustainability. I'm also, and we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, believe that the feminine element in the world, the sense of wonder that she wrote about, the sea around us, that notion that there's a balance between thinking and rational thought. In fact, Margaret Atwood, another famous Canadian, in the introduction to David Suzuki's book, The Legacy, says that that neurologists tell us that we can never think in isolation of emotions and vice versa. So she wasn't quoting me, but I certainly agree. I'd like to know the neurologist that made that point, because neurologists tend to be a little overly rational, and they tend to be men. But so thinking like a mountain, feeling like water, those are the kinds of metaphors. And that, as I said, is the concept of intergenerativity. How can you imagine what it means for a mountain to think, or a body of water to express emotions? Well, it can be frigid, it can be flowing, it can be steamy, it sure can be emotional. So the words that we use to blend domains, particularly this world of mountains and water, and I will end with one last editorial comment. In the conversation on the planet water, which of course it should have been called, not the planet Earth, the feminine spirit is in ascendancy. Because I sometimes like to talk to the people in Wisconsin about the billion-year-old mountains that they have in Wisconsin. They're pretty tiny, because the glaciers and the snows, and even the drops of water, will ultimately prevail in terms of their ability to affect the sustainability of mountains. So when I was climbing, I can tell you that it was arduous. At that level, you really have to plan out 10 steps before you take a rest, or I did, because I'm obviously not in the best possible shape, but I was in better shape back in 2009. And the guide kept telling us all these mountains in Nepalese, and I kept saying, please, I don't know, I don't want to hear another mountain I can't remember. And then I had this insight, you know, the mountains, in the United States, and probably in Canada, we have this bad habit, we name mountains after famous white men. And they've had names that the indigenous peoples have given them for years. Well, the mountains don't even care about the indigenous people's names. I mean, they like the fact that the indigenous people keep them more sacred than we do. But the fact is, as I was walking by hearing all these names, I said, oh, good, I learned to think like a mountain. Who cares what the name is of that peak? And by the way, the mountains don't differentiate one from another. They're all interconnected. So that was my moment of thinking like a mountain. And that is my message to you, that we have tried to create a space where we can take on the stories that society tells, the stories that are misleading, and there are a lot of them. And if we don't figure out how to create spaces and tell stories and use every power in our armamentarium, and I don't like military metaphors, every source of generativity, that including information technology, to create more hopeful stories about the future, I'm afraid our saga on this planet may be a lot sadder in the years to come. And so with that upbeat thought that there are things we can do, just as David Suzuki says, and Canada has got a very important role to play, because you guys are really well positioned. You've got 50% of the world's fresh water, and you'll have a longer growing season every year that global climate change has happened. So that's why I'm here. I'm learning to survive in Canada. All right. So, could we have lights now? That's what, maybe I can do that.
Dr. Whitehouse, one of the people online had asked about us. You mentioned a study, she says, that talked about looking at the oldest people in the world. I don't remember you talking about a study, but do you know what she might be referring to?
Sure, and my apologies for not reading anybody else besides Professor Lynn McDonald online. That's with the expectation that she might one day look at it. Of course, it's the expectation. If I mention her name, you better tell her she's got to at least look at the beginning and the end. So, greetings. Yes, the book is called Blue Zones. And it's a study, it's an ethnographic study by Dan Buettner, B-U-E-N-T-E-R, I believe. And so he went around and he found where people lived a long life. And, you know, there were some in Japan that I remember vividly, and other places. And he found the variables that affected longevity. At least, you know, it wasn't a systematic study, but it was systematic, but it wasn't, you know, there were biases clearly possible. And that's why I said, really, the notion of these older folks, there are all these photographs that I can remember in my mind of them eating healthily and exercising, but also of them being a part of a community. And that's why I emphasize that part.
I know you're not crazy about statins. What do you recommend for people who have elevated cholesterol? Or do you have
I'm not an expert on statins. It happened that I was having a conversation with a primary care doctor, and maybe Michael would like to speak up if you'd like. Diet, I mean, I guess is the first answer. And exercise and all those things that go together. I mean, we've gotten a new name for these things called the metabolic syndrome, because diabetes and obesity and hypertension, and probably cholesterol, I don't think it's part of a formal syndrome, travel together. So if you address all those things, then that's a healthier way to do it. And that's what most doctors will say. They will, with a different degree of threshold, add in a statin. And of course, you know, it's another illustration of taking a pill is easier to do than avoiding your bad dietary habits. Yeah. I mean, you know, but I said to Sid, you know, I was on the board of the American Geriatric Society, so I know a little bit about their world, and they're the only group of people that have invented a disease to counteract other doctors. It's called polypharmacy. So geriatricians talk all the time about, well, 12 medicines. My record in clinic today was, you know, 14 medicines. That's not unusual. Because everybody's on Lipitor. Many people are on, and some of them are good, like aspirin, like, you know, baby aspirin. And I'm not recommending it to the audience here as a whole. It's probably a good thing for many people if they have any kind of vascular risk factor. So I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. But a certain skepticism about prescriptions, I think, is healthy.
As someone who looks at society and aging, one of my biggest problems always is how do we get around ageism? How do we have an experience that you describe in your school where you link young generation, young students, high school students, and seniors, to give that same message that aging can be so positive? Yeah. And that the message goes around to on every level of school, not just a specialized school. You have some good suggestions.
I think a couple of thoughts. One is that the current generation of people that are aging, the baby boomers, the bulls and the python, are going to change in the conversation about aging. We were talking before we started that Mary Catherine Bateson is one of my favorite authors. Has invented adulthood 2. You know, this period of time between 55 and 75, let's say. And so you can think about that phase of your life in a different way. For some that are fortunate, I mean, many baby boomers haven't prepared economically for retirement and we're in for a real shock. But I think reinventing aging, there's a movement I'm part of called positive aging. I met Suzanne Cook at that meeting. And I like the word wisdom because I don't think aging guarantees you wisdom. But if you make it to a certain point, it guarantees that you've had a lifelong set of experiences that if you reflect and integrate and share, then that's important. Two last thoughts. One is death. I think aging is, I sometimes say the operational definition of being older is when you're closer to the end of your life and you're beginning of your life. And I think a lot of the negativity associated with aging is associated with, oh, you're just going to die, I don't pay any attention. No. So the notion that we have to have a healthier attitude about death, that's a huge issue. And then the other is, I actually think there's a great danger that we will be developing lifespan, life course aging, because if you ask who in the United States is in poverty and uninsured, compare that to before Social Security and Medicare. It was the elderly who were impoverished and didn't have health insurance. Guess what? It's the kids. So So they are either on Medicaid or a program for the poor, or they're impoverished. So we have inverted that. So I think there's a great danger in democracies where old people vote that one way or another the baby boomers will take care of ageism. But we better darn well be sure we take care of ageism and don't sort childism. That's why we had that conference where we brought the child advocates and the elderly advocates together.
Is there any resource that you can suggest, to look on the eco-biosocial model regarding for quality of life?
I would suggest you look at the Collaborative on Health and Environment. That's CHE. It's something like che.org, C-H-E, but Collaborative on Health and Environment. Just Google that. They have a lot of programs and activities. They were the main sponsor for that conference that I mentioned. There's Healthcare Without Harm, which is an organization of hospitals that are trying to do things about this, because actually hospitals tend to have a big ecological footprint. The hospitals are a source of a lot of waste and unhealthy behavior. So look in that area. So those are just the two. But that's a new word. It's very easy. If you think you've invented a new word, you just Google it and see what Google says about it. But look at the American Public Health Association. In Western medicine, we have separated individual health, the American Medical Association and the Canadian Medical Association, from the American Public Health Association. It's a huge problem that we have separated those two. So go and look at some of the APHA. They have a whole section on school-based healthcare at the American Public Health Association. So that's themselves.
You talked about the powerful story that the pharmaceutical industry has and its possible effects on aging. But I also kind of wonder sometimes, where it sits a bit uneasily with me, the stories that the technology industry has as well. And do you see a potential similar, not to the same extent maybe, but there's a similar hazard related to promoting a really good story around technology and what it can do for aging and brain health at the expense of social policies that support community development?
So I think there are two religious forces in the world that are very powerful and not often identified as religious forces: scientism and capitalism. And the alliance between those two forces, which occurs in the information technology industry as well, are very powerful stories. I'm a scientist. I celebrate that, and I think science can be a spiritual activity. But when scientism becomes a religion and the faith in science is so great that we lose our sense of skepticism about what scientific medicine can do or what computers can do. I think an interesting conversion point there is Ray Kurzweil. Ray Kurzweil invented voice recognition largely, and I'm a user of Dragon Naturally Speaking, so I appreciate what he's contributed. But he writes about the singularity. Singularity is when human beings get downloaded into a computer. And he actually thinks that some of this is going to start occurring in the next few decades, which I think is a challenge. But he is taking all kinds of pills to keep himself alive longer because he doesn't want to miss the download opportunity. So that kind of blend of scientific and technological faith. I mean, he's got this law that progress is just inevitable. By the way, we've got to take on the word development and the word progress. And by the way, I asked David Suzuki, because this notion that we're developing countries, well, what does that mean economically? We can't be developing countries economically ad infinitum. And progress has to be viewed as more than one, iPod or iPhone 5. Japan is a very interesting case in point. So here we had David Suzuki talking to Mr. Inamori, the Japanese businessman who's a Buddhist monk. And I was in Japan in June. I probably got a little irradiated in Toronto because they were, minimizing the exposure. And I think that the Japanese people are redefining what we mean by wealth. I don't even know what the Japanese word for wealth is, but they're thinking about switching off nuclear, as you know, and there's been so much political activity in Japan. It's amazing because they're not usually, it's kind of occupied TEPCO to Toronto power place. Sorry, Tokyo, little non-Freudian stuff that was a little slip. That's actually not a semantic error, that's a phonetic error because it's the T and the T. So the Toronto power company is essentially corrupted in bed with the politicians. But if you go without nuclear in Japan that have no national resources, and they've been stagnant economically for a while, what does it mean to be a Japanese person and be wealthy? What does it mean for the Japanese people to be wealthy? English allows the word wealth not to be just how much money you have. And so I think that's the kind of thing we're trying to do in the school, which is to look at words like development and progress and wealth and say, what does it really mean to use those words, and to have those words drive us into this fascination with just getting bigger and unfortunately more dangerous for the planet.
Another person online was asking about, is there evidence? You were talking earlier about the intergenerational school, and she's asking, is there evidence for the potential of an intergenerational project to improve health, physical, mental, etc., and social participation for older people?
Well, I think the one study we've done is the study with the people with mild to moderate dementia. We have not done any studies of any kind of systematic way of the broader population of older people, or for that matter, any of the adults. Does it make a difference if we bring nursing students and medical students together with law students to study lead? People talk about interprofessional education a lot, but what is in fact, the dean of the School of Medicine here, I'm sure other deans are interested in, and your institute and this audience is interdisciplinary, interprofessional. But what evidence do we have that actually is really effective? Frankly, I've done a lot of evidence-based medicine. I was part of the Cochrane collaboration, and I have grown distrustful of the control of the epistemological space, to be fancy, that we have given randomized control studies. Formally speaking, a randomized control study only tells you maybe that the people that were in the study seem to benefit. Generalizing from a randomized control study to a larger population, going from efficacy to effectiveness, as we sometimes say, is quite difficult. And I sometimes say randomized control studies are the gold standard. Why? Because only people who have gold can afford to do them. So the drug companies literally do 5 studies and pick the best 2 to promote. I think, for me, the qualitative research and my eyes observing the kinds of smiles, the kinds of relationships that people have in this space are almost enough evidence for me. But we're in a space down south and probably up here too that everything requires evidence-based at SNAP. We've got evidence-based art. Pretty soon we'll have evidence, when we require evidence that PhDs in English are valuable to anybody. I'm not sure. Sorry for being my foil. So I think we've got to be really careful. It's another word, evidence-based. We doctors think that the lowest form of evidence is anecdotes. If you tell me what's been influential in your life, you're going to tell me lots of anecdotes. We call stories that could be more, more powerful in your life than any piece of data that you ever read that said you've got to do your life differently. So we've got to resist this notion that evidence only comes in certain forms. Well, I'm going to pick on Andre just because she might be responsible.
I was made vulnerable. But as it happens, it's interesting, this question of evidence, the anecdote. I mean, one of the reasons that I'm sitting in this room today is I am particularly interested in portraits of intergenerationality as they're manifest in the Victorian novel. And the one that I'm working on right now is by George Eliot, who's one of the great Victorian novelists, and perhaps, according to some, the Victorian novelist. And what has made me so just so fascinated sitting here listening to your talk is the portraits of intergenerationality that I'm fascinated by are the scenes in which old and young, and for Eliot it often is bipolarized that way, in which old and young hold hands, and that this sociality that you are mentioning, the empirical evidence that you're discussing in the context of the intergenerational school, is represented in these works by Eliot as these key moments of sociality. And my greater argument, actually, that I'm giving at a conference next week, is that Eliot is drawing from a long line of literary portraits of intergenerationality, sociality, the importance of touch, and so many of those outcomes in your quality of life study that are all implied through these literary discourses as being meaningful in some way. And the fact that that meaning is being represented and engaged with, and I would argue put forward as Eliot as worthwhile human things, to me, I would shuffle that towards the almost evidence or evidence of a kind pile, to say that these ideas of intergenerationality are not instinctual, but they are operating in ways that are maybe scooting around limited ideas of what evidence can be. That there's a long history and a very strong human compulsion towards exactly the values that the intergenerational school is bringing to the fore. And that's one of the reasons I'm so excited about the work you're doing. And I think there's a tremendous intergenerativity between disciplines. Just the very little bit of work that I do, I see already. See the stuff you've been talking about today.
Three reflections. One is touch, so important, forgotten in the middle maybe a little bit, but that's so important. And also, I think you're talking about where you look for intergenerativity. It includes going back in the past to history, and it includes going cross-culturally, because I think those opportunities give you the range of what's humanly possible, if you will. And I think we can be very limited, even in a society as advanced as Canada, by, sorry, I'm practicing for my Canadian citizenship exam. I was born in the UK, by the way, so I alluded to earlier, so I find this country rather wonderful, particularly because I love camping. But I don't like hockey, but that's another matter. Yeah, I think we have to be open to blends and other things that allow us to put things together. You don't have to, science says you have to discover something new. I mean, sometimes you have to rediscover something old, put it together, and that becomes new. I mean, that's what intergenerativity is saying, I think.
Actually, I think that's very true.
Suzanne, I'm sorry. No, go ahead.
I think it's also worthwhile to look at the evolutionary aspects as to where did we come from as a society, how did we evolve as human beings. Because I like to tell my children, millions of years of evolution cannot be undone by a couple hundred years of technology. So there's a structure, an underlying structure as to how we evolved as people together, young and old, all colors, all shapes, of all sizes. And for some reason, with technology and the Industrial Revolution, that whole concept has become disintegrated. And especially in North America, I find, not having grown up here, it's very compartmentalized. You're young, you're middle-aged, you're old. Period, stop. There's no real fluidity to it, which doesn't make sense at all. So I think rediscovering the old concept of, okay, as from evolution, that's how we started. Maybe that worked really well, got us here millions of years later. Maybe it's worthwhile looking at that.
I agree. I think as a neurologist, I frequently say that in fact, David Suzuki told many stories when he was in Cleveland, one of which was the time that he was talking to a family audience, and he said, he addressed himself to the children in the audience, and he said, there's one thing I want you to remember from my talk, kids. It says you're animals. Parents weren't quite, but I think we've developed a brain that allows us to create very complicated explanations for what we did. And really what we do is driven by parts of the brain we can't even articulate. They're deeper down that reflect our animal natures. And I think particularly neurologists tend to be these hyper-cognitive, rational people. And I think we can't forget that there's that underneath it all, there's some pretty important drives that we share with other species. So do you still have Michael had his hand up, Susan? Forgive me, I just happen to know a few names. And in Michael's case, I'm practicing it because I forgot it last time. I got even know.
Thanks for that lovely presentation. I think you gave us so much food for thought. I guess it's sort of building on Andrea's last comment about young and old holding hands. I wanted more examples of what sort of an everyday experience would be at the Intergenerational School. Just, you know, the structure of the curriculum. There's a little bit more flavor of that.
So the 227 kids are in classrooms with about 17 or 18 kids. So one thing is, I say there are three reasons our school may be successful. Intergenerational relationships, small classrooms, and my wife is the principal. The adults are not in the classroom for the most part. They're out in a hall, sitting on a couch. We have couches. We have small spaces where, as you saw in the reading mentoring in the program, they're reading books, or they're sitting at a computer terminal together, or they're doing music. So it's you know, when you say intergenerational school, adults are learning with kids. I say no, the adults are not sitting in the little chairs with the kids. They're out in a different space, which encourages, it's extracurricular in some sense, but it's not. But it's relationship based. So one mentor who may come every week for 2 weeks works for over 10 years with, he's probably changed classrooms, with one teacher or one classroom. So there's a relationship to individuals and a relationship to the teacher and a relationship to the classroom. On any given day, they may be on a field trip to a long-term care facility. Or maybe on a field trip to the nature center. So the model, you could also restate it as experiential and service learning. Those are other words you could apply to words. Does that help a little bit?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Michael.
I didn't actually have my hand up, but I wanted to thank you for your thought.
Well, I'm projecting on you. I wanted to have it. We doctors, and how many LMDs in here? Sorry.
Respirologists don't tend to be quite as hyper-cognitive as neurologists. So.
Right. So I think this is the time to put in a plug for the Jackman Humanities Institute, because I know I met some of you there, and that's a wonderful part of a working group, and speaking there later. So, it was Lynn and this center and a few other these points of connection in Toronto that made me feel this was a community that has spaces already that are receptive to these kinds of ideas. And for the most part, you seem to be smiling in agreement. Any last minute, really deep, critical question?
Absolutely not. But three anecdotes, I guess, out of some of my research experience that utterly supports the intergenerational thrust of that school. One was probably 12, 15 years ago with adolescent immigrants of different backgrounds, and they commented in at least two different ethnic groups about the fact that here, what we do for them is have programs for youth, and then someplace else we have programs for older people, and someplace else we have programs for their parents. And these two groups both spontaneously said, why don't you have programs that bring us together as a family. So if we're going to change as we acculturate or whatever into Canadian society, we can do it together. And you won't have family strife, you'll have the family mutual support you're supposed to have. The second was supervising a thesis, and the young woman was looking at the traumas experienced by young children aged 6 to 10, coming from one country to another. And what she was completely unprepared for was that overwhelmingly the hardest thing for them was being separated from their grandparents. And the third thing was a study that I did just in the past couple of years on people who come to Canada, women over the age of 50, men over the age of 55, and hearing them lament that one of the hardest things they had to endure here was, in effect, being divorced from their grandchildren and even their own children to some extent by the demands of time, the acculturation of one group, not of the other, and so forth. So, you know, what your wife and that school are doing, I think, is quite wonderful. There's another way that a school that I saw in another bit of research was doing to integrate the parents and grandparents, and that was through the library.
Yeah.
They had rocking chairs, and the grandparents would sit and hold a child and read a story, and the stories were not all English, because the research was about schools that had, you know, a huge percentage of children who were first-generation Canadians, and they used the library as a wonderful way of integrating the eldest generation in particular.
There's a reason why the book is the foundation of my presentation. I could say more, but I'm now framing the story of this meeting. So thank you for making it standing room only. And thank you for not doing your job, because we are now almost 15 minutes after a 1.5 hour conversation, and I'm delighted it was with an extended conversation at the end. So thank you very much for coming, and I enjoyed your comments.
So